Hello, today we'll be looking at the advantages of the scientific method essay for the issues essay in PY3. We are on page 54 in the textbook. Now, through today's video, we are just going to be looking at the 115 mark essay, the advantages of the scientific method essay. This should be a fairly short video as we should know most of the information as we covered most of it within our research methods and in lesson. Within psychology, many studies have used scientific methods to collect data and carry out research. The use of these methods has many advantages, as we know, which range from control, so we can make cause and effect statements, to allowing us to replicate our studies, which is absolutely crucial. The most scientific method in psychology is obviously a lab experiment, but in fact any kind of experiment is generally considered to be scientific. So it is more about the environment of which we are looking at, which is controlled, etc. This is not to say that other methods are not scientific. For example, an observation can be considered to be scientific if done some of the scientific methods, such as control, are applied to the setting as well. Now, it is easy to fall into the trap of believing that scientific methods mean a lab experiment, whilst, as I've highlighted, it can mean other methods as well. So it's more about the scientific environment in which the experiment is done in. The main part that you really need to fall in here is that you are looking at the scientific method rather than just lab experiments for this essay. Now, the question which we're looking at, it can appear in various descriptors, but we look at it as explain the advantages of the use of the scientific method in psychology. Bearing in mind it is a 15-mark question, so it needs to be quite quick and concise. So we'll start off with, what is the scientific method? The scientific method offers a way of understanding human behaviour within a controlled environment by testing behaviours which might not be possible in the real world. This is because we are able to produce a highly controlled and objective environment in which we can measure the behaviours in which we are observing. Therefore, meaning we start to make cause and effect statements about the behaviour, as well as that it also allows us to replicate the experiment because we have done it in that controlled setting. This information that we've just outlined would be the start of your essay. Now, this is just a quick introduction here, just to really get you thinking. Freud's views are not considered scientific because they are highly subjective in nature. He uses case studies as his favourable method here. Now, he draws the conclusions. They're not particularly replicable, so we cannot replicate them in hope that we'll be able to get the same results. So therefore, when we are using counterbalancing information, Freud is someone we will rely on, and we'll refer to him later on in the essay as well. Now, the main features of the scientific method are as follows. So the variables are identified and controlled, which means we've got good control. So scientific methods have a good control over most extraneous variables, especially in the lab experiment. So therefore, we're able to say that we have measured what we intended to measure rather than extraneous variable impacting on the results. It produces empirical evidence, therefore it produces quantitative data. This quantitative data can then be analysed using descriptive and inferential statistical tests, which can then be used to prove or disprove a hypothesis. Cause and effect statements can be made. This scientific method lets us state that is the IV causing the changes to DV. Operationalisation of the variables. We can clearly define our DV and ensure that we can measure it accordingly. Objective, which is really, it says what it does in the tin there. It's objective in the sense of we aren't drawing subjective conclusions from the data. We can see trends within the quantitative data, etc. Replication, we're able to replicate it in the aims of getting the same results again, which therefore means that obviously if we can get the same results again, that it is a valid experiment. And falsifiability, it's the ability to prove something wrong, which with scientific methods being used, we have got that potential to do so. Within the essay of being well controlled. So lab experiment has the greatest control and allows the experimenter to control and manipulate the IV in order to see the effect on the DV. In order for this to be a fair test, all other conditions must be controlled, and the best place for this is a lab setting. Because it's artificial, it's contrived, we control and make what is in that environment. So therefore, it's very much unlikely that something else will be interfering with our results. Now, scientific methods are then able to operationalise these variables in order to test the hypotheses accordingly, which is a huge benefit for us because we've been able to clearly define what is going on in terms of our experiments. Now, as mentioned previously, the keyword operationalisation will need to be understood here. So it's clearly defining the variable to make it more concrete or measurable. So our example here is sociability in a lab experiment. So is this variable clearly defined? How do you think we can measure this variable? So how can we make this more clearly defined? We could define it as the amount of friends a person has. How can we measure it? By checking how many friends they've got, how many people they interact with, through observations or just statistical watching of them. Now, for us, obviously, we need to store operationalisation in our memory banks because it is something which will come in handy on the other part of PY3 as well. Now, the fact that we can operationalise our variables means that obviously the lab settings have got complete control. Operationalisation here, evidence of this can be seen with Loftus and Palmer and how they operationalise their variables. So Loftus and Palmer were able to operationalise the reliability of eyewitness testimony into speed estimations. Now, the strengths of Loftus and Palmer operationalising those variables. Now, what did Loftus and Palmer show? By changing one variable, such as the verb, could influence the outcome of participant speed estimates. As a result, the evidence which they could produce was empirical evidence. It was quantifiable statistics, which then allowed them to draw objective conclusions from that data. What does this mean for the research as a result here? It's increasing in validity as it's not based on unfounded beliefs. It's got that quantifiable empirical evidence behind it, which is objective in nature, meaning that we've been able to draw good conclusions as a result. So, what type of control does this allow for? So it allows for high control, which is therefore reducing the influence of extraneous variables on the dependent variable, which is the speed estimates. Therefore, Loftus and Palmer and us using scientific methods can make cause and effect statements as a result. Now, the final point to raise here is, moreover, the credibility of this scientific method allowed the practical application of informing the criminal justice system that eyewitness testimony should no longer be solely relied upon for conviction, due to the fallibility of the eyewitness testimony. The scientific method uses methods that allow for objective way to measure and collect data, and therefore none of the results are impacted on by the researcher, and therefore increasing the validity and the support of the theory, due to the more objective and more controlled methods that are used. So in comparison to other less scientific methods such as observations and case studies, the scientific method is more objective and allows for control as a result of using these methods. Now, the example that we use for this is, who could you use as an example for objectivity? We've got Gardner and Gardner here, who were absolutely fantastic in improving objectivity. Now, they developed a strict criteria that allowed for them to objectively measure Washoe's use of language. So, remember what the procedure was. They had to have 3 researchers report it, and it had to be within a 15-day period. It was very, very strict. Anything outside of that 15-day period was considered as a new spontaneous signing. They did this to ensure the observer knew what to record, and this is therefore reducing that subjective interpretation of the behaviour, making it more objective and therefore making more replicable as a result. Now, replication. Obviously, replication is crucial because if we are able to replicate the experiment, we are therefore able to see whether or not we can get the same results again. If we are able to get the same results again, therefore it means it's high in reliability as a result. Now, which two methods allow for replication? So we've got lab experiments and field experiments. This is because they both still have that degree of control over the IV and the DV. Why is this beneficial? Because it increases the reliability of the findings as a result. Now, our example that we use for this is Bandura. Now, Bandura's experiments were replicated time after time, and we were able to then see that his original hypothesis was correct. Now, Bandura was able to replicate his experiment several times to support his hypotheses that aggression can be learnt through observation, imitation, and vicarious reinforcement. The rigorousness of such method also allowed variations of the experiment to extend his social learning theory as a result. Now, there is the argument that some scientific methods allow for high ecological validity. This is because they can be applied to real life and they give a very similar representation of the behaviour that is witnessed in real life as well. So what type of scientific method renders or is high in ecological validity? One that we look at quite frequently is a field experiment. Now, if we think back to AS and our core studies, one of the ones that we looked at was Langer and Rodin, the nursing home core study. Langer, the effects that lack of control has on well-being in a natural environment, which is increasing the external validity of the findings, which means that we can apply it to the external or the external world. Therefore meaning that it's high in ecological validity as a result, which therefore makes it more valid, and we can see that it has some real world implications. Now take a few minutes just to look over this slide, because this should start to ring a few bells when we think to levels of consciousness, because we use this within our dream essay. Now, falsifiability. What can you explain? Can you explain what this term means, and why would this be a strength of the scientific method? Have a few seconds to ponder this. Now, falsifiability. Now, falsifiability is the ability to prove a hypothesis wrong. Now, why is this a strength? Because you've got the ability to prove a method or a theory incorrect or more valid as a result of doing so. Now, when we look at lab experiments, and especially with the idea of attachment, we can look at how this might be a benefit for us. Our main example here is with Harlow's monkeys. Now, by experimenting with monkeys, Harlow was able to disprove the behaviourist theory of attachment, that food positive reinforcement causes the infant caregiver relationship. Instead, he showed how important affection and contact comfort is for a healthy attachment. So he started to disprove the hypothesis of the learning theory, therefore giving his theory more credibility, because people can replicate his experiment, and therefore by replicating his experiment, adding more validity and increasing the reliability of his experiment as a result as well. Now, as a final counterpoint, you can throw in this last little bit into it. Without falsifiability, we cannot test the validity of theories. One particular example where we cannot test the validity of theories is Freud. Now, Freud, we have got the ability just to recognise that a majority of these theories seemingly are correct. However, they are lacking the ability to falsify. So we have not got the ability to prove it right or wrong. Therefore, meaning his theories ultimately lack validity and credibility as a result, because we cannot prove them right or wrong, and they give the impression that they are of a gut feeling nature.